Please welcome Viktoras Nakas, a member of the board of North American Lithuanian Catholic Federation, Ateitis. To introduce our next speakers, Professor Brad and Ms. Danielle Wilcox. Note, there will be a question and answer session after this presentation. Questions may be asked in person or may be written down and placed in the baskets located in the back of the wall. There's one over there and then one on the left side. And the moderator will share them with us all. Welcome.
Thank you, Simona. I'm a member of the committee that planned the program for this conference, and we decided that we wanted to have a session that was devoted to one of our organization's cornerstone principles, šeimyniškumas, which roughly translates to fostering family life and family values. Given the strains that the family unit has undergone in the United States and Canada in recent decades, we decided it would be a worthwhile topic to explore. As we thought about prospective speakers, one of the names that surfaced was Dr. Brad Wilcox, who is well known for his research into marriage and family life. In the course of our own research, we came across a YouTube video from 2014 in which Brad and Danielle Wilcox delivered a joint presentation at the University of Virginia on the topic of courtship and marriage. Our committee agreed that this husband and wife duo were exactly the speakers we were looking for. A few words about each of them. Brad Wilcox is Distinguished University Professor of Sociology and Director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. He's also Future Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies and a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His book, Get Married: Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization, was published last year. He also writes regularly for outlets like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and National Review. He and Danielle have been married for 30 years and have 9 children. Danielle currently manages advancement for an ecumenical ministry serving students at the University of Virginia. Previously, she taught in Catholic high schools, followed by 20 years working in state and federal education policy. She says her most important role is wife and mother to their children, ranging from 12 to 25 years old. In addition to serving in volunteer roles in her parish and her children's schools, Danielle has been an advocate for adoption support, having been blessed with 5 of her children through adoption. The title of their presentation is For Better: How to Foster a Strong and Stable Family in the Modern World. Please join me in welcoming Brad and Danielle Wilcox.
Thanks for that gracious introduction, Victor. I want to begin just by mentioning that we're kind of coming from Virginia via a family Thanksgiving in Pennsylvania. And in Virginia, I'm regularly walking by Mr. Jefferson's university and really standing in the shadow of Thomas Jefferson's University. You kind of can see the top of his university there in the picture, and the bottom is his home, Monticello. And he was kind of known for many things in terms of both being an educator and then an architect. But as our founder, he's, I think, particularly known for being the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. And that was kind of the first thing that he listed here on his tombstone in Charlottesville, where we're coming from for this lecture in a sense. And in the Declaration, I think we all kind of appreciate those words about the importance of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for our country, for America. And when it comes to kind of that latter phrase, the pursuit of happiness, I think we can think about how we're doing on that kind of core American value, the pursuit of happiness today. And I wanted to suggest to you this afternoon that we're not doing very well in America today on that score. We're seeing kind of survey after survey after survey kind of indicating that happiness in America is coming down in recent decades. Coming down in recent decades.
So you might be wondering, what's happening? Could it be that we're pursuing the wrong goods? One of the messages that you hear swirling around in your heads often, assisted by the elite institutions, whether they're the mainstream media, the academy, or Hollywood, is that we need to prioritize mammon over marriage. It's easy to fall into this trap of the Midas mindset. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of King Midas, the Greek myth where King Midas was given the gift of everything he touched turned to gold. And there are many times when I'm writing tuition checks, things like that, that I went thinking, I wish I were King Midas. But it's a cautionary tale. Eventually, King Midas realizes he can't eat food because his grapes turn to gold, his food turns to gold. His daughter turns to gold, so it's hard to have a relationship with somebody who's just a gold statue. But usually the cautionary part of the tale is left out, and we're really just reminded over and over that marriage may be an obstacle to our financial success and an unencumbered life. There are a number of headlines that kind of prove this or make this point. This one in Bloomberg, an author wrote about the single life, childless life, and how it leads to greater financial success for women. So skip marriage, skip children. Ladies, focus on your job and all of the things that it can purchase, whether it's travel and shopping, which is the main focus of the article. Just as a side note, this actually, the main thesis of the article was actually discounted. And in fact, married women over the lifespan are much more financially secure than single women. But when you're reading headlines like this, what jumps out at you is, yeah, I could fly to the Caribbean with my girlfriends. But that's not necessarily the path to happiness. But it's not the only article. You can see The Atlantic, another one of our leading elite magazines, writing about the case against marriage as being overwhelming, too restrictive for women. There's also this New York Times article that features Brooklyn author Amy Shern decrying marriage as overwhelming and parenting as exhausting. Parenting can be exhausting, but there's more to it than that, of course. But it's not just progressive voices that are decrying the institution of marriage.
So I think we kind of all know that for a long time, the left has been kind of giving a negative message about marriage and family life towards women. What's kind of changed in recent years, there's been also a lot of people on the right, the online right, the manosphere, also articulating kind of a negative message about marriage, but focusing not on women, but focusing here on men. We've got Pearl Davis on the left up here, and then Andrew Tate on the right. Pearl says that marriage is a death sentence for men. And Andrew Tate says there is zero statistical advantage for men when it comes to marriage. So they're kind of now adding their own voices that are kind of in the spirit of this Midas mindset, again, kind of discouraging young adults from embracing marriage and family and encouraging them instead to focus on things like education, money, and work. Work is seen as kind of the source and summit of people's lives oftentimes in the U.S., in part because they're getting messages really both from the left and the right now, kind of encouraging them to kind of steer clear away from family and really focus again on kind of this more mammon-related mindset where what really matters is your degree on the wall, the money in your bank account, and the nature and character of your paid work. Because the thought here, right, is that the path to a meaningful and happy life runs away from family and not towards family. And this cultural shift, this kind of Midas mindset that's kind of come upon our country and really come upon much of the higher income world today, I think helps to explain why what we're seeing in the US is that the American heart is closing. it's closing to dating, mating, marriage, and parenthood in the U.S. What we see in this particular slide is that the marriage rate in the U.S. has come down by about 60% since 1970. And that number can be kind of a little bit abstract, I think, for most of us. So what does that mean kind of more practically for the young adults in the audience, okay? Which is, I think, particularly relevant in terms of like the future of the country. What it means is we're now projecting that about 1 in 3 young adults will never marry in the U.S. And this is kind of a record demographic kind of pattern. We've never had so many people projected never to put a ring on it, never to have a wife, never to have a husband as they go through, midlife and later life as well, of course. Now, as you can imagine, there are plenty of voices in the world that I live and work in the academy, in places like UVA, that would kind of discount these trends, would sort of suggest, no big deal that marriage is down, that family is down. I'm thinking of, for instance, Eric Klinenberg, who is the author of a book called Going Solo, and a sociologist at NYU. And in talking about his book, Going Solo, with the New York Times, he couldn't muster a negative word about the falling fortunes of marriage and family life in the U.S. He said, for young professionals, it's a sign of success and a mark of distinction, being solo, flying solo, a way to gain freedom and experience the anonymity that can make city life so exhilarating. So again, he's using words like freedom, exhilarating, and success to kind of signal how he thinks about living a single and unencumbered life in the U.S. today. So this kind of gives you some sense of how a lot of our elites are thinking about these family trends in America today. But as I spoke to ordinary young adults, especially in their 30s across the U.S., I often had a kind of a different sense of how this kind of growing singleness was kind of working out for 30-somethings across the U.S. And thinking here, for instance, of a guy that I'll call Scott, and by the standards of success in today's culture, nothing should bother Scott. And kind of by the Midas mindset, he's got a college degree from Clemson, an engaging career as a military contractor, a house of his own, and a good-sized bank account as he pulls in more than $100,000 a year. But these educational and professional accomplishments are not enough for Scott. He says, I've got degrees on my wall, I've got accomplishments and certificates, but it doesn't mean anything in the end, is what he said to me. Scott feels alone and at sea on many a day. Quote, I have to get up every day and look in the mirror and realize I am alone. I have nobody. And he worries about the kind of fate that might await him if he should ever fall sick later in life. Quote, I have no help, If something happened to me tomorrow, there'd be no one for me. So Scott is struggling with a kind of toxic mix of loneliness, meaninglessness, and sadness. Now, to be sure, we know that there are many single folks out there who are doing well, who are flourishing, and there are many married folks out there who are floundering. Okay, so I don't want to kind of deny, those two realities. But what we're seeing on average when it comes to looking at these happiness trends that we referenced a little bit ago in this presentation, what we can see here is that happiness is down for Americans across the board, but especially it's down for Americans here in this bluer line, Americans who are unmarried, whereas it's only a little bit in this red line. Okay, so unhappiness basically has grown by about 3 times since 1990 in the data, and only a little bit for married Americans. Now, what is it about marriage? Well, I think one thing we could say about marriage is that Aristotle noted, obviously many, many years ago, that man is by nature a social animal. And what he's getting at is that our ties with others, with friends and family, end up being crucial to our welfare. They afford meaning, direction, and a sense of solidarity to our lives. Opportunities both to receive care, but even more importantly, to extend care to others. And it's these ties, not the priorities associated with Midas mindset, priorities like money and work, for instance, that end up being most conducive to happiness. In fact, we have relatively new evidence from a scholar who lives not and works not too far from here at the University of Chicago, the Chicago economist Sam Peltzman, telling us that the most important factor, the number one factor accounting for why it is that Americans are failing in greater numbers to realize that classic Jeffersonian pursuit, the pursuit of happiness, is that fewer Americans have put a ring on it. Fewer Americans have gotten married and stayed married. So this is the bad news that we're kind of conveying to you this afternoon, that there are kind of fewer Americans who are managing to get married and stay married. And that also helps to account for why we're seeing kind of the pursuit of happiness come down in our country in recent years.
So where's the good news, you might be wondering? And that's what we want to share with you, is that there is good news about marriage, and there are different pockets or communities that are succeeding at building strong and stable marriages. Some of these groups that are the masters of marriage are grouped into 4 different categories where they have really succeeded. Asian Americans, conservatives, strivers or college educated, those with a plan in life and realize partnering would help them succeed, and the faithful, those in a religious community. Undergirding these 4 groups, or what makes them so successful, are the 5 pillars of marriage. We made it easy, the 5 C's. I have to put my glasses on because it's that age. Communion, children, commitment, cash, and community. So we'll walk through the 5 C's, and we'll let you start with communion.
And one of the things, too, that I want to underline is this idea at the beginning of my book's subtitle that kind of Americans should be defying the elites. And kind of one of the points we're going to make throughout this presentation in terms of just these 5 C's is that even though many of our elites are actually pretty good in practice in embodying these different pillars or embracing these different pillars of strong marriages, oftentimes in their public capacities as C-suite executives, as journalists, as professors, as school superintendents, for instance, they don't publicly stand for these 5 pillars. So it's in this sense that we're kind of encouraging all of you today, and then my readership more generally for the book, to think about, in a sense, resisting a lot of the messages we get that kind of bear on some of the values and virtues that are connected to these 5 pillars. So in terms of the first pillar, communion, what I would say is that too often today our elites are stressing a kind of me-first approach to marriage that privileges autonomy, freedom, and self-interest. Again, kind of thinking about what I want in love and marriage, what I think I need in love and marriage, rather than what's good for my marriage or for my family or for my spouse. And one example of this comes in that most important domain, which of course is money in marriage. And what we're hearing from a lot of journalists and financial professionals is kind of this idea that you have separate accounts, kind of her account and his account, have sort of substantial amounts of money that you're kind of keeping separate for him and her in your marriage. We have, for instance, the financial guru Susie Orman talking here about the way in which it's good to have a separate account that ensures that each spouse, in her perspective, is protected as a couple in case the relationship doesn't work out. That's kind of Susie Orman's perspective. It kind of just gives you a sense of how people are being encouraged to kind of keep substantial nest eggs for one another in their marriages. But as I talked to ordinary couples across the U.S., I had this sense that people who took a different approach to marriage were more likely to be flourishing. I spoke, for instance, to John and Maria Erickson, and when they were getting ready to ship out to Iraq, they were both in the Army at this point. They were in the 82nd Airborne, and they were engaged, about ready to get married pretty soon. Maria headed to the store to get some items for both of them, and her list included some things that were pretty expensive, including ballistic glasses. She said to me, they were expensive. Something like $160 is what Maria told me. So when she brought the items back to John, she made it clear to him that she expected to be paid back. But John just kissed her on the forehead and said to her, what is mine is yours, and yours is mine. And now we're going to be married, and it's all going to be equal. So he had a much more kind of we before me approach to money. Now, when this was happening, it was pretty hard for Maria at first to kind of deal with or accept John's perspective, because her own parents had kept separate pots, separate checking accounts when she was growing up. But talking through money with John kind of led her to embrace this. And the irony is that she actually ended up benefiting quite quickly from this, because John had brought no debt into their marriage, and she brought a lot of debt from her days as a law student into their marriage. And so by pooling their money, and basically paying off her debts, they were able to kind of quickly put her on a debt-free pathway. And they've been married more than 20 years, have got 4 kids, and they certainly think about kind of their approach to money as sort of part and parcel of the way in which they communicate with one another, they trust one another, and they also depend upon one another. And they are by no means an outlier. So I did a survey with YouGov, and what we found in that survey is that couples who embraced joint accounts were markedly happier. That's sort of less, it's sort of like the lighter orangey bar up here at the top of the screen here. They're also less likely to report that they were thinking all about divorce. And there's even a new study from Indiana University where they randomly assigned newly married couples to 3 different groups, to having separate accounts, to picking kind of their own financial strategy, and then to be assigned joint accounts. And the couples who were randomly assigned joint accounts were markedly happier in their first 2 years of marriage compared to couples who were assigned to some other kind of condition in this new Indiana study. So pretty strong evidence that there's something about kind of this we before me approach to money that's beneficial to couples. So this is kind of one way in which I think the evidence tells us that embracing communion in marriage, embracing a we before me approach to marriage, fosters a sense of unity, teamwork, and mutual service that redounds to the benefit of couples. Okay, so this is kind of the communion point then, that we should kind of be taking a sort of more team-based approach rather than a me-first approach to marriage, including in terms of how we are approaching money in marriage.
The second pillar is children. I think the slide says child-centered, so having a child-centered marriage, which doesn't necessarily mean helicopter parenting or letting travel sports dominate your family schedule, although at times we have been guilty of both. But rather, it's about being open to children. And I think when you're talking about we before me, there's no better way to force oneself into a we before me approach to marriage than children. It's now husband, wife, child number 1, 2, 3, whatever the Lord brings, right? So with children, though, the we grows, but it also is an opportunity for us with children. As those of you who are parents know this already. There's nothing like parenting that exposes your vices and forces you, or hopefully inspires you to grow in virtue as a parent. This isn't always the message that you get. You can see this Time cover, which exalts the child-free life. I can't really read the subtitle, but I do believe it's something about having it all. Like, guess what? Child-free life, you can have it all. If you look, the picture does most of the work for us, though. We have an attractive couple on a white sand beach, and this is what the child-free life apparently looks like. I think the implied contrast is what a family day at the beach looks like, which is oftentimes loud, sunburned children, toys scattered everywhere, seagulls attacking our snack bag, missed naps. So you're thinking in that quick moment, even I might look at that and think, that looks really good. And maybe for an anniversary it would be. But it's really what you're being sold here, right, is an illusion. And it's really pleasure. Arthur Brooks, who has sort of made a name for himself as a Harvard happiness scholar, he distinguishes between pleasure and happiness. And I think with parenting, it's very helpful to understand that distinction. This is an example of pleasure, and it's an emotional response to an experience that you have. Whereas happiness is distinct. It contains 3 elements, according to Arthur Brooks: enjoyment, satisfaction, and purpose. So enjoyment, similar to pleasure, it's an activity that is enjoyable, but it's a shared activity that leads to shared memories. And satisfaction is distinct in that it requires hard work. I think anyone, for example, who has been an athlete or a musician knows all the hard work that goes into actually mastering a piece, and then the satisfaction that comes from being able to play it, just in that flow state. There's a lot of hard work with parenting, but it's directed towards a purpose, and that's the final point, is that the purpose is greater than yourself. It's greater than just our own individual desires. It's greater than even our human desires. It's supernatural, and it requires a lot of sacrifice. So with 9 kids, there have been lots of easy days. I mean, I probably have like 2 or 3. I don't know. But there's a lot of hard that comes with it, but there's true happiness that's all part of that formula that I think is there. Okay. And it's not just my word. It's not just my own personal experience. The research does show that married dads and mothers are happier, particularly when the goal isn't to avoid being parents and the hassle of being parents, but with the leaning into parenthood. Another study found that families or couples, or I guess families, that spend an above average amount of time in fun activities with their kids are significantly happier, as are families, and my kids never believe this statistic because my husband does like to cite it a lot. Families who spend an above average amount of time working together on chores are also happier. And in fact, chores brings more happiness than fun activities. So here, I heard that. It's always hard to convince our kids of that Saturday morning for their chores, or even last week I painted a dining room with my teenager. Lots of grumbling, but I realized, even just thinking about this and thinking about this talk, that it wasn't just the satisfaction of our dining room is actually a new color and doesn't have smudges. During COVID, that's just a total aside, sorry. During COVID, we have this paneling that goes up pretty high, like 3/4 of the way. So our now 12-year-old, who at the time was, I don't know, maybe 7, he used it like a parkour course. So he just would grip it along the way. And there are dirty footprint smudges everywhere. Not anymore. We took care of that. But we have the satisfaction of knowing our dining room has 5 years later been restored. But it was also the satisfaction of seeing my teen, who didn't want to do anything, learn how to cut in the edge, do the edging, clean up all the splatters on the floor, because neither of us felt like putting a drop cloth down, and that wasn't very smart. But the satisfaction that we had for the conversation spent together, satisfaction of having completed something well together. So this is a long-winded story of pointing out, though, that leaning into parenthood is really a vehicle to happiness and not an obstacle.
So the third C is commitment. Okay, and again, what I want to suggest to you this afternoon is that oftentimes our elites are giving us messages that are contra to forging a committed marriage. And really since the 1960s and 70s here in the States, a lot of elites have kind of discounted the importance of marital permanence, kind of this till death do us part, commitment. But in more recent years, the kind of like elite assault on commitment has sort of gotten even bigger. And it's now kind of focusing in on sort of the value of sexual fidelity in marriage, the value of monogamy in marriage even as well. And this came through last year in a big story in the New York Times entitled, quote, "How a Polyamorous Mom Had a Big Sexual Adventure and Found Herself." Of course, painted a pretty positive portrait of Molly Winter's new book. And of course, Molly is from a borough in New York City. Which one do you think she's from? Brooklyn, of course. They're always from Brooklyn. I mean, it's amazing. I don't know what's in the water in Brooklyn, but I don't know what they're doing there. But anyways, but kind of giving us, again, this idea that, fidelity doesn't matter, monogamy doesn't matter, they're not important. We should kind of cast these older commitments to the side. But in talking to ordinary couples across the U.S., had the sense that people who kind of took a different approach to commitment were probably more likely to be flourishing. I'm thinking here, for instance, a guy that I'll call Patrick. Patrick's actually not conservative, he's not religious, but he is a family-oriented guy. And this tall, handsome, and well-spoken redhead in sales is careful about protecting his marriage of more than 20 years. He meets a lot of people, plays guitar in a band on the side, and travels a lot for work, all things that might boost his risk for infidelity. But he is intentional about protecting his marriage in real life. Quote, when I'm meeting new people in my line of work, I talk a lot about my wife and kids. I want them to know I'm a family man, is what he said to me. He's also careful about his online interactions. Quote, my wife is tagged in a majority of my posts. My status is listed as married, and interactions online are treated the same way as if in person. I don't follow old girlfriends, as there's a reason that they're in that category. Okay, so he's kind of maintaining a certain kind of fence, both in the real world and also in the virtual world, to kind of protect his marriage, his relationship with his wife, Kelly. And it's probably no accident that when I asked Kelly to rate their marriage on a scale of 1 to 10, she gave her marriage a 10 rating, okay? So with 10 being the best. So this gives you some kind of sense of sort of how kind of living out the virtue of fidelity in a variety of ways as one expression of commitment is helpful for Patrick and Kelly. But of course, they're not alone. What we see is that Americans who embrace this idea that any kind of sex, once you're married outside of marriage, is always wrong, here in yellow, are markedly more likely to be very happy in their marriages than Americans who are married who take the less traditional view now. That's in red. And unfortunately, really since 2014, we have seen an increase in the number, the share of Americans, particularly in more secular and progressive circles, who are kind of taking this more, polyamorous friendly view. But the bigger point that I want to make here when it comes to just this third C is that commitment, often measured in a variety of different ways, is often the best predictor of a happy marriage. So something we need to kind of keep in mind in terms of fostering happy marriages, both here in this community and more generally in the country as well. So the fourth C is about cash. And I think we can kind of appreciate that a steady stream of cash and having some shared assets both tend to strengthen and stabilize marriage, both here in the U.S. and elsewhere. But there is a way in which I think our views about kind of how money comes in have been sort of challenged in recent years by elites, specifically kind of making the argument that it's not important for men to focus to some important extent on being decent and reliable breadwinners for their families. So one piece in Slate said, quote, husbands who have wives who out-earn them are happier than those who do not. And it also said decoupling breadwinning from masculinity is associated with concrete benefits for both men and women. And it's this kind of rhetoric that's sort of part and parcel of a kind of a deeper, more profound, I think, effort to basically suggest that gender is fluid. And there's really nothing that's kind of essential about being male and female in the context of sex and marriage and family, that we kind of were exposed to this kind of ideology quite a bit, obviously, these days. But on this question of kind of breadwinning, I think what this sort of Slate-based perspective doesn't appreciate is that the research really could not be clearer, okay? That men who have decent paying, stable jobs, who are employed full-time, are, even today, much more likely to get married in the first place, much more likely when they've got kids in the household to have wives who are happily married, and they're also much less likely to land in divorce court as well, okay? And so we see, for instance, a study by Sasha Killewald, who was at Harvard, I think she's now gone to Michigan, But when she was at Harvard, she was looking at more than 6,000 couples and kind of looking at the association between employment for women in those marriages and employment for men in those marriages to kind of figure out how employment was related to their risk of divorce. And when it came to looking at the women, what do you think she found was the link between women becoming unemployed or not being employed and their risk of divorce? What did it do to their risk of divorce, do you think she found in her study? It stayed the same. There was no effect. So when women were employed, not employed, unemployed, no story from Sasha Kilwald's work on divorce. But when men lost their jobs or were unemployed, what she found was that they were about 33% more likely to get divorced. So kind of giving us a sense that even today, there's something about men's employment that's a sort of a stabilizing force, I think, both in their own individual lives and in their marriages as well. And it's kind of telling us that contra the elites, a good male breadwinner is still important, in the main and on average. Of course, we all know that there are exceptions, but that in general, when men are flourishing in their work, they are much more likely to be seen as attractive boyfriends. They're much more likely to end up getting married, and they're also much more likely to stay married as well. So this is kind of the fourth C, is about cash and kind of the important role that men should be pursuing when it comes to giving their family a measure of financial security by being gainfully employed. So now we're on to the fifth C, about community.
Yes, the final pillar is community. I probably don't need to convince many of you that community is important. You have gathered for a Lithuanian Catholic conference. I also got a tour today, so I saw all the ways in which community happens here in this building. So community is something I know that you agree with, but it's not something that everybody has. And in fact, it's surprising, or what may be surprising to those of you who are so thickly connected here, is that so many people don't have community, and opportunities for community in America have really declined. Robert Putnam wrote a book, maybe you're familiar with it, Bowling Alone, which chronicled the demise of many civic institutions and communal groups. So you lost not just your bowling league, as the title suggested, but your Rotary clubs dwindled, your garden clubs, your volunteering opportunities, and there was also declining church attendance. Not everyone is upset about losing faith communities or declining attendance, as some people, or I guess I should say some elites, have written about. For example, in this article, this interview in the New Yorker, a sociologist took time to explore the many ways in which religion's restrictions, rules, and in particular its purity culture was felt too restrictive, brought on guilt and shame for people, and that throwing off religion might actually be better to your own happiness, self-fulfillment, self-actualization, etc. Now, I think this is a limited view of church communities. As Catholics, we participate in our church communities, for the sacramental graces we receive through the Mass that we just attended, confession, our wedding vows, vocations, etc. But it's also the network of friends we have and community that we build up in our church. Again, I think you know this, but not everyone does. And also we have people in different situations, right? So I'm encouraging my children to invest in their church, not just because I'm making them, but because it's good for them. One of the examples we had was when we had 5 kids, so we had adopted 5 kids. They were 9 to 2, and they had some special needs. Surprise, we found out we were pregnant with twins. So they're 16 now. This is when they were just cute, and it was, anyway. They're still cute. They're still really nice, but needless to say, we were a little bit overwhelmed at the time when we had these twins and these other older kids, some of whom had, special needs, as I mentioned. But our church community stepped in a major way. We had 6 weeks of meals. We had folks who came over and played with different kids, tutored different kids who were really struggling. We had people, I had one friend, and this was so sweet. So she was part of our church. She came over, and I just had a sink full of dishes. I was so embarrassed. She just talked to me the entire time and just cleaned my dishes and was like, no, I love this. Like, it's so therapeutic to me. I'm like, it is not therapeutic to wash somebody else's dishes. But that was an example of how she helped out for us. And so that was a sweet time, but we've had many other times where the church has stepped in, or where we, as part of the church community, have tried to step in. And so I guess my encouragement to you is to invest in your church, both in the ministries that exist, but also trying to figure out what doesn't exist and how you can step in. I had a mom friend of mine who her own son is really struggling. He's in prison, just addiction issues. So she started a St. Monica Society, and it's a prayer group to pray for kids who have fallen away, older kids or adult children who have fallen away from the faith or have more serious issues. But that's something where it happens in the church, and it's that support is different than, I think, anonymous support, because you are in a shared faith, a shared community who knows the values you're trying to promote. So the church community, contrary to what the New Yorker article said, actually provided, I think, a lot of support for us personally, and for many others. But you don't have to just take my word for it and my anecdotes. This table here indicates that shared faith does lead to greater marital happiness. You can see the top bar here, where nearly 4 out of 5 husbands and wives who are regular church attenders mentioned or indicate that they are very happy in their marriage, compared to their secular peers, which are the bottom 2 bars. It is worth acknowledging that at any one time, 1 in 5 wives and nearly 1 in 5 husbands is struggling in their marriage. But that's, I think, also where the church community hopefully can help. Moreover, faith also protects against divorce. Harvard's Tyler Vanderweel study found that regular church attending couples were 47% less likely to divorce. And then a more surprising statistic that doesn't get talked about too much is that church-going couples are actually having more frequent sex. So regular church-attending couples, the top 2 bars, are more likely to indicate that they have sex once a week or more, compared with a minority of secular couples. And in addition to frequency, they tend to be more satisfied with it. So you can see the top 2 bars, which are longer. That indicates that they are happier. That's 3/4 of them. And this is in contrast, of course, to the earlier New Yorker interview, indicating that most people probably benefit from endowing sex with sacredness. Overall, investing in our faith and in our church community strengthens and stabilizes marriage. I'm going to let you.
Okay. So again, the idea here too is that a lot of our elites are kind of, I think, discounting the importance of faith in a variety of ways. But we're kind of basically showing here that on a number of important outcomes, marital happiness, marital stability, sexual frequency, and sexual satisfaction, faithful couples in America tend to do a lot better than their secular peers. And this is kind of, I think, often unrecognized, both on social media, in the academy, and in the mainstream media as well. But the broader point we're kind of getting at is that the path to a meaningful and happy life today doesn't run through kind of the Midas mindset, kind of focusing in a singular way on things like money and career. It actually runs through marriage and family. What we see is that Americans who are embracing marriage and family are generally happier. And this is particularly true for Americans, actually, kind of if you break out the data, who are either college educated, religious, and or are conservative, part and parcel because they're often achieving more success when it comes to forging a family-first lifestyle. So you kind of put all this together, all of our kind of comments together this afternoon. I think there's basically, bad news and good news to think about. The bad news is that marriage in America for adults is in retreat, and that's in part because too many of our elites And now too many ordinary Americans have embraced a kind of Midas mindset. They're under the misimpression that life is about money, work, and me, me, me. They've put mammon before marriage. This is a big mistake, as we've seen, because virtually nothing supplies the kind of meaning, direction, solidarity that marriage and family do. The challenge then is that we must foster a marriage mindset for the 21st century in our churches, like this one over here, in our schools, like the one back here, in our homes, and even on social media and in our universities. The aim here is to forge a family-first marriage mindset and to equip our young women and men with the virtues that will allow them to flourish when it comes to dating, marriage, and family life. Taking steps like this could not be more important, because equipping the next generation to do likewise is the best path to reviving the ideals at the heart of American civilization, ideals again like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We need to help the rising generation understand that the future is family, that embracing our most important social institution dramatically increases their odds of living a meaningful and happy life. Or to put it in Charlie Kirk's terms, we need to encourage and enable today's young men and women to get married, have children, build a legacy, pass down your values, pursue the eternal, and thereby seek true joy. So thank you.
We have about 20 minutes for questions. So if someone wants to come forward to ask a question, I see that someone has submitted a. If you want to be anonymous. So we don't have any anonymous requests yet, right? No. Okay. I've got one or two that I wanted to pose. The first one is you talk about a lot about defying the elites. And if I understood correctly, you had indicated at one point that they tend themselves in their personal lives to embody the 5 C's. So what is the logic? I mean, I'm trying to understand why they would be living one set of values and preaching another set to a wider audience.
It's a great question. So I think what we can sort of see even geographically, and I don't know kind of the Illinois story here as much, but we can see kind of closer to where you and I live is that just to the west of our major cities in Boston and in New York and in the DC area, what we see is that there is a band of counties that have very high numbers of married, stable 2-parent families. And these are counties that are very highly educated, relatively affluent, and politically more liberal. And so they're kind of like the classic example of sort of Americans who I would say often will kind of talk left when it comes to family, but walk right in their own personal lives. And so what I think is happening here is that they kind of get the message from their universities and colleges, from NPR and the New York Times. There are certain kinds of appropriate progressive values and ideas and norms that one should embrace kind of basically in general or in public. But they also seem to have kind of this amazing capacity to realize that those often don't apply to themselves, and to their own family members. And so one example of this is that in my classes at UVA, I will ask the students, do you think it's morally wrong to have a kid outside of marriage? And a clear majority of my students, who generally come from more educated and affluent families at UVA, will say, no, it's not wrong for a girl to have a child outside of marriage. And then I'll ask them a little bit later in the same class, kind of, how would your parents respond? This is like in a fall class, a little bit earlier on in the semester. If you were to come home and tell them over Thanksgiving dinner that you were expecting a baby, or that your girlfriend was expecting a baby, would they be freaked out? And I have this anonymous clicker in class. And 97% of my classes that their parents would freak out if that was the kind of report from them. And I asked them too to kind of, give me their views about their personal plan. And I asked them, is it your personal plan to get an education, work, get married, and then have children. And in that context, about 95% of my students say that's their personal plan. So again, kind of in their milieu and for them personally, they're embracing broadly kind of neo-traditional approach to marriage and family. Most college-educated Americans today in America do get married, do stay married. And that's true for more affluent Americans in general as well, where we have seen kind of, marriage really lose ground is among lower middle class, working class, and poor folks for whom there is a kind of more of a different pattern. But I think it's in part because they're not getting sort of more marriage-friendly values articulated in the pop culture, in our public schools, and other cultural arenas that could be helpful to them.
About 60 years ago, a scholar and future senator published a study in which he argued that the black family structure was undergoing disintegration, and that was evidenced by high rates of family-headed households and out-of-wedlock births. And he argued this was a major obstacle to black progress and that it perpetuated a cycle of poverty. So my question to the two of you is do you see that as still a major problem in the black community? And if so, how do you crack that nut? And then related to that, there was a book written by an author you know very well, I'm sure Charles Murray, who said that he was seeing a similar phenomenon among the white working class. So if the title of your book is, the end of the book is, how do we save civilization? How do we save this part of civilization? How do we, get out of this cycle?
So we do see both when it comes to race and class in America, a major marriage divide where, again, Americans who are more educated, more affluent, Anglo and Asian Americans are more likely to get and stay married. And working class whites and Hispanics and African Americans are less likely to be kind of forging strong and stable marriages today. So I think part of the challenge is, can we articulate, again, norms and values in our public schools and the pop culture and the mainstream media that would be more marriage friendly, but also do things like, taking policy measures to eliminate what's called the marriage penalty now. So what that means is that when you're receiving Medicaid, for instance, you're more likely to benefit from cohabiting if you've got one or two or three, little kids, than you are from being married in terms of how Medicaid works. There are, I think, policy steps we could take to eliminate that marriage penalty and have it be not financially disadvantageous to many lower-income families to get married and to stay married. But I also want to be careful, too, to acknowledge that we actually have seen, even for working-class families in general and for black families in particular, an upswing in marriage in the last decade. And so the share of black kids, for instance, living in a black married family has risen 6 percentage points since 2014. And this kind of, I think, just tells us that, these trends need not necessarily move in one direction, that they can move in different directions. So I think we actually have seen a bit more positive coverage around marriage in the last few years. I think the challenge now is to kind of extend that understanding, that appreciation more broadly into a wider set of public institutions and, important civic institutions that are kind of shaping the character and context of working class, poor, and African American, communities.
There was a Wall Street Journal article, I think within the last week, about conservative moms who are deciding to have kids first and then a career. And what I found interesting was that, according to the article, 15 years ago, self-described conservative and self-described liberal women between the ages of 18 and 35 were having children around the same rate. So I'd be interested what you think is, do you think this phenomenon that we see among conservative moms deciding to have kids first, do you see that spreading to liberal moms? Or is the divide going to continue or even grow between the two groups?
So I would say, at least on current course, this divide is going to grow in terms of what we've been seeing with the kind of, it's a growing divide. So it was especially growing since around 2010. And why do you think that's an important date? There's a growing divide between women aged 25 and 35 who are moms versus staying childless, where the conservative women are having kids at much the same rate as they've always had them. And liberal women aged 25 to 35 are seeing their rates of motherhood just fall precipitously since 2010. What do you think is one of the big factors there? Nope, I don't think birth control is. I mean, you could say Obamacare may have had had some hand in that, sure. Yeah, but this pattern has really just affected liberal women, not conservative women. So what I'm getting is, I think that part of the story here is that social media has really kind of been much more consequential, obviously, since the introduction of the iPhone. Is really kind of oftentimes, propagating, spreading a much more anti-natal and anti-nuptial message to young adults, but particularly to younger women who are more left-leaning. So that's sort of, I think, what we've been seeing in terms of this growing divide in motherhood.
Well, the only thing I would add to that is I think that social media, because it's an algorithm, it is siloed, where if you are liking the posts that are more liberal leaning, then that's the influencers that you're going to be following. So maybe they're the Midas mindset influencers. On the other hand, for conservative women, and you're liking the posts maybe of a happy family, and next thing you know, you're loving the post of the woman who has married her college sweetheart and is having her baby, over 9 months later. So I do think social media, it can go both ways, where it's influenced on the left, but it's also influencing on, the right. So for conservative women.
So, yes, please.
Here we go. I wanted to explore a little bit more this concept of elite. So in our organization, Lithuanian Catholic organization, we use the word elite in a different context. Some of the founders of some of the philosophies that we follow used to talk about us being elite, that you take the blend of these 5 core principles and that makes you different, right? That makes you a leader in the community. So I want to a little bit understand this concept of elite, because it sounds like there's some two-facedness going on here with this. Who are these elite? Are we talking about social media influencers? Are we talking about pop stars? How does one understand what this is? Because right now, it's a very amorphous term, us, them being something special and elite, us not being that. So if you could put some more context around who it is exactly that we're talking about here and what do they have to gain from this? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Andreas. I would say that the idea that I have primarily is that Americans who are kind of shaping the commanding heights of the culture when it comes to, education, pop culture, media, and public policy are the primary elites that I was thinking about in terms of writing this particular book. And they generally, of course, not always, but generally kind of lean to the left, both politically and culturally. And I think have, in their capacity as elites, in the commanding heights in those domains, in education and in the pop culture and in public policy and the mainstream media, have often pushed our American culture in a more leftward direction, in a more Midas mindset direction of late. But again, there would be exceptions, in terms of people who are well-educated and who have, roles of influence in business and religion and other domains that would be kind of pushing the culture in a different direction. And this kind of event would be one example of that. But in the main, I would say, and just if you look at, for instance, at college-educated liberals, they tend to be the ones via polling, like with Gallup and whatnot, who are the most skeptical of the value of marriage, for instance, for adults and for kids as well. So as I'm thinking about kind of operationalizing elites, I'm thinking especially of college-educated liberals who tend to dominate the heights of our culture and who tend to have a rather dim view of the importance of marriage and family.
How much of this is a socioeconomic story? Because, for example, the description was, hey, it's lower middle class that's having these issues more so than the upper middle class. So how much of this is explainable just purely by socioeconomic status and where you fall in that hierarchy?
So a good part of the story of kind of marriage and family in America, especially marriage, is about class. And you can measure that in terms of just the education divide. Americans who are not college educated are much more likely to end up getting divorced, not getting married in the first place, to experience family instability and single parenthood. And Americans who are college educated are much more likely to forge strong and stable marriages. And I think that's in part because working class and poor Americans today are much more likely to have men in their communities who are not employed on a full-time basis. And that has, I think, both kind of material, but also kind of psychological and relationship, outcomes that are often deeply problematic for couples and communities and families in working class and poor America. But there's also a cultural divide too that we're seeing emerge, where a majority of conservatives are married now and a minority of liberals are married, where a majority of religious Americans are married and a minority of more secular Americans are married. So we kind of can see these, marriage lines, for instance, cutting along both class lines, but also cutting orthogonally in some ways along these religious lines related to religion and ideology as well. But the final thing that I would say about the class dynamic is it has to be understood too, I think also in kind of a cultural way as well. And that is because if we were to kind of go back in a time machine to the south side of Chicago in 1950, for instance, we would have seen that the vast majority of kids growing up in the south side of Chicago were growing up in, married two-parent families. It's only really since the mid-1960s that, marriage really breaks down for working class and poor Americans and for African Americans in great numbers. I think that's in part because the cultural revolutions of the late 60s and 70s kind of gutted all the norms and customs and institutions, including ones like the one just over there, that were kind of classically very helpful in stabilizing and solidifying marriage and family life, not just for the educated and the affluent, but also for working class and poor Americans as well.
So I am a college-educated liberal, but I do belong to the Rhode Island Conservative Organization. And by and large, I enjoyed and agreed with much of your talk today. I was, however, a little taken aback when you gave Charlie Kirk the last word. Yeah, just quickly, I did a little Wikipedia search. I mean, to my mind, I know we should not speak ill of the dead, recently dead, but it's almost like a who's who among bigots in America. And I was a little taken aback by that.
Yeah, the quote. So, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily agree with everything that Charlie Kirk said, and he had a lot to say about a lot of different things. But I think what was really striking about his short life was that he really did, especially in the last 3 years, underline the importance of marriage and family life, both more generally and then also for his own wife and kids as well. And so that was really kind of the reason that I, in part wanted to spotlight his words here. But I think too, I guess we'd have to sort of go through maybe an issue by issue take on all of Charlie Kirk's comments, because he actually, obviously had a lot to say about a lot of issues in his talks across college campuses. So I think it's also the case too that on the right, as I mentioned at the beginning, that we are seeing, some voices that are really articulating kind of more anti-marriage themes as well. And what I appreciated in part about Charlie Kirk's witness and voice was his capacity to, push the right, push conservatives in a much more family-friendly direction. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to talk to you about his, some of his other perspectives as well.
As a mental health counselor myself, I'm just always very curious and being a young adult as well, how can we help young adults escape the fear that rising housing costs or child care costs, feel like that, sometimes make it feel like married life can feel like impossible. How can we escape that like negative notion? Yeah.
Good question. So I think in terms of housing policy, that's certainly one of the big challenges facing Americans, especially in sort of metro areas like Chicago. We have seen really in the last 30 years some pretty troubling trends in about 37% of the kind of areas where housing is being, sold. My own kind of Institute for Family Studies does have a pretty kind of detailed agenda about how we can kind of bring down the cost of housing, and it's about, basically shrinking lot sizes, adding ADUs to lots, trying to reduce the number and scale of regulations that are applied to developments as well. So there's certainly kind of, I think, work to be done in that space. When it comes to children, I would also kind of articulate the value of pushing forward a more generous child tax credit, which would give families, especially families raising younger kids, more resources to help cover the costs of raising the next generation. So that would be, I think, another policy measure that I would encourage politicians on both sides of the aisle to get behind. But I do want to also just mention that I think sometimes people have this idea that I deal with at the University of Virginia, students, that they have to kind of reach a certain level of financial success before they go ahead and get married and have kids. And I think what they don't appreciate is that when you actually get married, you're often combining, especially at the beginning, two income streams, so you're actually in a more financially secure position than you would have been prior to marriage. And then when it comes to kids, at least when you first have kids, babies themselves are not incredibly expensive. So it's kind of important to, just appreciate that as they get older and go to school and then especially go to college, they become very expensive. But I think sometimes we can, worry excessively about the cost of having kids. And if you're in a secure and stable marriage, I think, the burden of, handling kids is much diminished.
Hello, I had kind of the same question as Polakaitis had about elite, and you kind of answered that question, but my question on that question is, why do we call them elite? Because then we get them that bump that they shouldn't have, to my understanding. And the actual question is, how do you compare like marriage, or I wouldn't use the word cohabitating, like living together, why marriage is better than just living together? And just to finish, that was my husband, and I am kind of liberal. We live together 33 years, so we agree with what you said.
So in terms of the benefits of marriage versus cohabitation, just kind of speaking more generally, I think what marriage is understood as, and this is not simply in a Catholic or Lithuanian or American context, but kind of more globally, recognizing that marriage is a kind of human institution in most civilizations across the globe in terms of time and space, is that marriage is a way of publicly expressing your commitment, to your partner, and to family and friends in ways that tend to kind of deepen that commitment and make that relationship more stable. And that in turn is good for you as a couple, generally speaking, for your community that benefits from having people in stable relationships, and especially for any kids that are born and raised in a much more stable family context. What we see when it comes to cohabiting couples, even in Europe actually, and not just in the States, is that couples who don't get married and who cohabit instead are more likely to end up breaking up than their married peers. I think that's in part because there's just not the same set of norms governing and guiding cohabitation, and there's not the same ceremony, around being together. And so the example that I give to my students at UVA is that most Americans who are cohabiting can't even tell you the day when they sort of began to cohabit. And if I forget my anniversary with Danielle, I'm in trouble. So, but obviously the point is that people will kind of often move in, like in the U.S. context, they'll bring in some clothing, some boxes, over the course of maybe a couple weekends, and then they'll be kind of living together. And again, by contrast, folks who are getting married have a very clear wedding date where there's a ceremony where family and friends are gathering and kind of witnessing them take vows to one another. And that's just kind of one other way we can kind of think about the importance of collective ceremonies. And marriage, I think, benefits from being an institution that begins with an important, large collective ceremony that's sort of a signature statement about your mutual commitment, whereas cohabitation's often happening in contexts where one party is more interested in the other party than the other party is in them, and there's just a lot of ambiguity around that, that common commitment that then can lead to instability and difficulty, and does in the U.S. context especially, much more so than it does for married couples.
So when you participate in these kinds of presentations, sometimes you can read the room. And during this presentation, I got a sense it was very quiet here, and people were very attentive. So I think it's safe to say that you both gave a very engaging presentation. So I wanted to, on behalf of everyone here, I wanted to thank you for doing that on such an important topic. And I especially appreciate that you sacrificed part of one of the most important family weekends, part of your Thanksgiving weekend, to come and share your insights with us. And also, you braved the winter storm that's coming soon. Brad and Danielle would have liked to have stayed longer, but they got to head back to O'Hare to catch a flight before the white things fall. So, thank you very much for joining us.